So I wrote this script the day after Star Trek Picard's 5th episode, Stardust City Rag, came out. And after doing my review, I found a lot of the conversation surrounding this episode has centered around the character of 7 of 9, rightfully so because she's one of my favorites. Namely, how some were understandably upset that a fan-favorite character still seems so defined by her traumatic experience, specifically with the Borg and being assimilated by the Borg, even decades after having been rescued from the Borg by Voyager. For example, she still goes by 7 and not Annika, still defining herself in Borg terms. She also actively states she feels she has lost a piece of her humanity and lost hope in a better tomorrow.
Picard still thinks there's a place in the galaxy for mercy. I didn't want to disillusion him.
Oh, and she blows up this girl into a blood mist. So there's that. Now, for me, 7 of 9 is one of my personal favorite characters in all of Star Trek, behind maybe just Jadzia and Ezri Dax. And catch me on a different day, and I'll probably tell you that 7 of 9 is my favorite character in all of Star Trek. So I completely understand and even felt that to see a character that many of us identified with seem to still be in a place of not only dealing with trauma, but actually in many ways a darker place than she was at the end of Star Trek Voyager is a hard pill to swallow. That the choices that she makes here in this episode, especially with seeking revenge and murder, and also lying to characters like Picard, feels out of character or feels like a stretch too far for what we know about 7 of 9. And for many, it even feels too dark for Star Trek, a show about showing a positive vision of the future. But for me personally, while it hurts to know that this is the path that 7, a character who has meant so much to me, has walked down, I think it makes perfect sense for her character. Because I believe that 7's journey here showcases how those who survive trauma still struggle with defining themselves and finding hope that they will ever be who they were again, even years or decades or an entire lifetime after the traumatic event. So let's analyze 7's journey through trauma and her struggle with finding hope. After being separated from the Borg Collective by Janeway and Voyager, 7 of 9 initially resists considering herself human. She still defines herself, her identity, as Borg.
I am Borg.
You were Borg, but you're human now. You are part of our crew.
For a brief time, I was human. But I have come to realize that I am Borg.
We all create an inner narrative surrounding who we are. We all orientate ourselves around basic truths of our beings, of understanding ourselves. And this narrative is defined by ourselves and our actions. Like, for example, I define myself as someone who tries to see the best in the world and the best of works of art. Or I define myself as being a YouTuber, or define myself as being a kind, caring person. And everyone has elements of that. But by defining herself as a Borg, 7 of 9 is actually resisting something else. She's resisting reconciling with and defining her trauma. She's actively resisting saying she is suffering a traumatic event.
You could be experiencing some sort of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Makes sense. You were assimilated by the Borg. You've gone through an intense, prolonged trauma.
I was not traumatized. I was raised by the Borg.
And you know what the Borg say about resistance.
Your distinctiveness will be added to our...
7.
A traumatic event occurs when something happens to us that is outside of our control, that causes a change in our identity or sense of self. It could be the loss of a loved one, sexual assault, physical abuse, or a loss of a limb. No matter what the trauma, it's all about a loss of control and how we are irrevocably changed by that event, despite having no autonomy in that choice. 7 of 9 is orientating her narrative of her life around a choice that she did not make for herself. She did not choose to become a Borg, she was forced to. And that loss of autonomy was trauma. In the Star Trek Voyager episode The Raven, 7 is called back to the site of her assimilation and relives her traumatic event, the moment where she lost control over her identity. 7 realizes in this moment that her inner narrative, her sense of self, that she orientates and defines herself as a Borg, that it was not something that she controlled, and how she actually should define herself and how she actually defines herself in her head is as a human. And that definition was irrevocably taken from her. The definition of who she sees herself as human inside her head, cannot be fully reconciled with who she actually is in the present day, and how she was changed was something that she didn't control. Post-traumatic stress disorder occurs due to our inability to reconcile who we are, our inner narratives of ourself, with our understanding of our current self, because we did not have full autonomy within our experience. We do not recognize ourselves because we did not have full control over who we are now. To reiterate a point from a previous video I did on PTSD in Star Trek, those suffering from PTSD usually experience 4 symptoms of clusters. Number 1, re-experiencing, 2, avoidance, 3, hyperarousal, 4, negative thoughts and beliefs. Re-experiencing is defined by repeated, involuntary memories of the traumatic event. Nightmares are common, feeling like you're watching the event happen again in front of you. Avoidance is characterized by people trying to avoid feelings, conversations, or even people that remind them of a traumatic event. Hyperarousal is a reaction to the re-experiencing and avoidance of trauma. Many may have difficulty concentrating, have outbursts or anger, and trouble falling asleep.
You will be assimilated. Resistance is futile.
Finally, negative thoughts and feelings may have left someone feeling a loss of interest in activities or people they once loved, feel distant from others, feel like they're cut off, or feel like their life has been cut short.
What if my parents and I had not encountered the Borg? What would our lives have been? I would have been raised by them, learned from them.
These are all feelings that 7 of 9 experiences throughout her time reintegrating into humanity on Voyager. And she realized that she is unable to fully reconcile her human identity and her Borg trauma. One her own and the other decided forcibly for her. Trauma and PTSD changes you in your relationship with yourself. Yet healing from PTSD isn't about overcoming it, but working it into the definition of who you are. It's about reframing your relationship with yourself and your trauma, not ignoring it or burying it. You must confront the trauma and those around you in healthy ways, and it's often done internally, not just externally. And this is what Star Trek has always been about, characters integrating 2 disparate identities within themselves. Not always through trauma, but a lot of the time. And this goes all the way back to Spock reconciling his human and Vulcan sides, integrating 2 disparate experiences and identities within yourself to come to a synthesis. 7 of 9 on Voyager tries throughout her time on the show to reintegrate her Borg experiences with her human ones, defining herself within both of them, and accepting the changes that were forced upon her, but not letting them override or overwhelm who she is now. And she does this in numerous ways throughout her on and off-screen appearances, such as processing her memories of her time as a Borg and integrating them into her identity.
The child you spoke of, the girl. Her favorite color was red.
But there are a few of particular importance to Seven's eventual destination in Star Trek Picard that I want to talk about here. Firstly, she dedicates herself to meaningful work. First, on Voyager, she works with the crew in order to help them find their way home. When she arrives back at Earth, we learn in Star Trek Picard that she eventually joins the Fenris Rangers, a group that defends the innocent out in the border worlds of the Federation that the Federation can no longer help. She finds a way to define herself and her identity through tangible actions of her own choosing, solidifying her identity through something that she chose, as someone who fights for the oppressed or fights to help others.
Ranging is my job. It's not saving the galaxy, it's helping people who have no one else to help them.
She regains her sense of autonomy and control by deciding something for herself, and as such, she contributes value to the community and world around her, and therefore finds value in herself and her identity. And this sense of value is incredibly important to defining someone after trauma, because a lot of people after trauma devalue themselves, see themselves as less than because they aren't fully who they were before. They need to find a sense of that who they are now is just as valuable. And on Voyager, she was repeatedly affirmed by Janeway as an important member of the crew, with Janeway many times risking her own life and the crew's life for Seven.
I betrayed the crew of Voyager, threatened you with assimilation. I did not expect you to return for me.
Looks like you still have a few things to learn.
By others attributing value to Seven, she was able to find that value within herself. And when she joined the Fenris Rangers, she continued to value herself by being someone who valued others. And finally, she committed herself to family relationships with others. We all find identity by our relationship to loved ones, seeing ourselves as a partner, a sibling, a child, a parent. These relationships help us define ourselves. And Seven does this first through her family on Voyager, and most importantly, with her eventual relationship with Icheb, a young teenager who she helps free from the Borg and who she begins to develop a motherly relationship with. Seven defines herself as a parent, and therefore gets another attachment and a solidified identity.
In the future, you may choose to fight the Borg, but you'll do it in your own way. You're an individual, and you have the right to determine your own destiny. It's time to regenerate.
All three of these forms of identity help Seven solidify and understand herself in who she is. She is someone who fights for the oppressed. She is someone who is valuable in that fight for the oppressed. And she defines herself as a mother, a caring figure. These are all pillars of herself that she points to show that she is someone distinct, individual, and defined by something separate from her encounter with the Borg. And these are all pillars that were taken away from her. Icheb is murdered, taking away her motherhood identity. In fact, she both indirectly and directly led to Icheb's death, even though it wasn't necessarily her fault, which could prove to her in her mind that she was never a good mother. This isn't true, because again, it's not her fault that Icheb died, but it could make her think that. Also, her work as a Fenris Ranger becomes harder. She's unable to save as many people before as the organization and the world around the Federation falls apart. And as a result of losing both these things, she starts to devalue herself, see herself as less than. And what's more, the people around her start to only see and value her as someone who used to be Borg.
When they get assimilated as kids, more of the hardware remains inside them.
Ear, eyes, neck, chest, spine, kidneys, hips, various bones.
Her old pillars of identity are now completely gone and replaced with an identity that is steeped in her trauma. So it's absolutely no wonder that the Seven that we meet in Star Trek Picard isn't in a good place. How she lies to Picard twice. How she seems motivated more by revenge. And how she feels like she's still not regained a sense of her humanity.
After they brought you back from your time in the collective, do you honestly feel that you regained your humanity?
But the most defining thing of the Seven we meet in Star Trek Picard is her loss of hope.
Picard still thinks there's a place in the galaxy for mercy. I didn't want to disillusion him.
There are numerous ways to process trauma and redefine yourself. But the first steps towards processing your trauma is a desire to process that trauma. To believe that the work is possible. To ultimately have hope. Not hope for a particular outcome, but what's called mature hope, or a hope that the effort is worthwhile regardless of how things turn out. Because trauma never really ends. Now, I've used this quote from Data that I'm going to show in a second numerous times in many of my videos, but it so perfectly encapsulates this mindset and the mindset of Star Trek in general.
I have asked myself that many times, as I have struggled to be more human. Until I realized it is the struggle itself that is most important. We must strive to be more than we are, Lao. It does not matter that we will never reach our ultimate goal. The effort yields its own rewards.
The effort of trying to regain humanity, to regain our sense of self, is itself the entire point of humanity. We find our humanity not at the end of the struggle, but within the struggle itself. This constant fight to find our better nature is what makes us human. It's not about being better, but constantly trying to be better. That's what Star Trek is about. We always talk about Star Trek as a utopia, as the ideals, like we get to see the perfect civilization. But really what Star Trek is about the striving to keep that utopia, to earn that utopia, to make that utopia actually something worthwhile. We never will, but it's something to strive for. That is what Star Trek is all about. And that is what surviving trauma is all about as well. For Seven, she has lost her hope. She has lost that sense of striving to be a better person. It's why she's mired herself in revenge and murder and lies. Because she has no sense of who she is as a person anymore without her anchors of identity. She feels like a non-person, defined by her relationship to her trauma and Borg identity. And that's where we leave Seven at the end of Star Trek Picard episode 5. A woman without hope, a woman who isn't struggling to be a better person. A woman who lost the Star Trek way. But you see, that's okay because that's the point of her story in this season. Star Trek, up until the modern era, and with the exception of Deep Space Nine for a little bit, though even that show still had elements of this, often told 45-minute self-contained stories. Each episode would present us with a problem that would be resolved by the end of the episode, reverting the characters back to a status quo so that they can have another brand new adventure next week. While they were able to change a little bit from episode to episode, they were mostly not that much changed from who they were in the pilot of the series. But to a degree, 7 of 9 as a character actually was able to buck this trend just slightly, giving us a character who we saw progress and process her trauma throughout Star Trek Voyager, integrating herself more and more with Voyager's crew and refining her humanity. But as good as 7's story was on Voyager, it also gave us a sense of forward momentum with trauma. That each process of dealing with trauma comes up, gets resolved, and then we move on to the next step in the next episode. Combine that with the aforementioned single story structure, and you get the sense that recovery from trauma comes in distinct stages that are coped with in isolation, resolved, and then progress forward until you finally completely refine yourself and everything's okay. But that's not how trauma works. Trauma is not always a straight line, nor does it happen in clearly defined stages. Sometimes we backslide.
Sometimes you gotta look back in order to move forward. Sounds to me like you're starting to embrace your humanity.
As 7 of 9 clearly demonstrates, surviving trauma is all about rebuilding identity around new orientations of self that go beyond who you are from your trauma. Yet these pillars can sometimes crumble, and even years later we can fall back into patterns we thought we moved beyond because now we're defining ourselves again by our trauma that we had thought we had dealt with. But it's the only thing that we are able to fall back on as a pillar of identity when everything else falls. I myself have suffered trauma in my life, and I won't get into the specifics of it right now in this video, but it was years ago and I often do well processing and handling it. But there have been many times in my life where I've lost people that I've cared about or a job that I helped define myself by, and then fall back into my trauma because it's the only mode of identity that I have. And I don't necessarily do it consciously, but I start falling back into old patterns of how I acted. And that's something I'm going to be dealing with my whole life, just as 7 does. But just because we find ourselves in that hopelessness, just because we backslide, doesn't mean that we can't find that hope again. And by the end of Star Trek Picard Season 1, I'd be surprised if we didn't see 7 again. Because, you see, she recognizes that she's lost hope. And by recognizing it, you can start to move forward towards hope again. And guess who is someone who has survived a similar trauma as 7 as a former Borg, and yet still currently has hope? And who 7 of 9 gave a communicator to reach out to, basically like the cell phone at the end of Avengers Civil War. Yeah, it's Picard. So maybe Picard, by the end of the season, will help 7 reorient herself again and pursue that Star Trek ideal of boldly going to seek out a new sense of self. And I, for one, am so excited to see that arc for 7 going forward.
You lost 20 years of your life to the Borg. I'd say that's punishment enough.
Thanks so much for watching this video. I want to do a follow-up on it once Picard Season 1 ends and discuss how 7 and Picard were able to reorient their identities and whether I had issues or problems with how the show portrayed it. But I can't really do that until the show ends, obviously. And if that video is currently up when you're watching this, I'll link it up here or down in the description below. But otherwise, please consider subscribing to my channel if you want more videos like this. And like I said, if you want to help me with my surgery and my current financial situation, it would honestly mean a lot to me if you would give to my GoFundMe or otherwise my Patreon or my PayPal account. Either way, that always really helps me, and especially right now, any financial help you can give is truly, truly meaningful. But regardless if you subscribe or if you help me out financially, I'm just very glad that you stopped by and that you enjoyed this video, and I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper. And special thanks to my commander level and above Patreons, Stefan Schuhart, BBD, Boyd and Marybeth Earl, Michael McGee, Lal Lindley, Wellington Marcus, Munir Amlani, Mari Neckar, and Marika Kuyechin.